Welcome to Event Horizon, the show that takes you for a walk on the paranormal with a splash of conspiracy. Today's show is called I See Ghosts, Stranger Things in Selma, Alabama. In July of 1854, the great author and journalist Ambrose Bierce published his article entitled The Difficulty of Crossing a Field. It was an article written about Selma, Alabama, that discussed the happenings of a farmer known as Williamson. He was a plantation owner who had just made a purchase of some horses from a plantation owner on an adjacent farm. Williamson, towards the end of the day, as dusk was just beginning to grip hold of the landscape, decided to take a stroll down to the plantation's overseer to remind them of that transaction and to remind the overseer to secure the horses. And Williamson began to walk down the gravel driveway of his plantation to go meet the overseer. You can imagine the crunch of his leather boots on the dusty gravel road as he moved slowly down the path and gradually, but not completely, out of the view of his wife and kids who were in the farmhouse. As he strolled along this path, Williamson encountered Mr. Wren, the owner of the adjacent plantation. Wren was riding in an open carriage with his son, James. An open carriage, so much like you saw in Little House on the Prairie. A couple of farm animals strapped to a wagon of sorts that carried some storage space behind them, but no cover like you would see on wagon train. So full visibility in every direction because of the lack of a cover and the height of the wagon relative to a human walking. As Williams passed Wren, they spoke, and Wren kept riding forward with his son, James, in the wagon until he remembered that he had business with Williamson. He turned the carriage around, and as he was turning the carriage around, the horses stumbled, distracting his view on Williamson, who was making his way through the pasture by this point, for just a split second. And in that second, from him diverting his eyes to the animals who were stumbling and almost flipping the carriage over, and back to where Williamson was, Williamson had disappeared. Now, in that moment, Wren called out to his son, "Where did he go?" Seconds later, it was said that Williamson's wife and children came running from the house, screaming, "He's gone." A massive search would take place for Williamson. No one found him. When there was a hearing to discuss what had occurred, the legal documentation of that proceeding didn't capture what some whispered throughout the town. James, his son, Mr. Wren's son, had said he disappeared. Just disappeared as he walked. Now, none of the slaves who were in the plantation were allowed to testify at the hearing, because as the article noted, they weren't competent enough to provide believable testimony. But those slaves corroborated James's testimony, or at least what people believed he provided as testimony that was not put into the record, that he simply disappeared. Many said for years after, they could hear Williamson talking in the fields, but could never see him. Now, as I mentioned, this story was written about my hometown, an occurrence which happened approximately 6 miles outside of Selma, on a plantation. Some people would say this is a story that may have been put together to explain the murder of Williamson so that people could take his assets. Others say there's something strange about Selma. Strange things in Selma. Why Selma? Why not other places? Why not New York? Why aren't people disappearing in New York in thin air in front of witnesses? Why not Australia? Why not the European continent? Why aren't these things happening there? Some people have told me that Selma is the consciousness of the planet, because it is the spot where positive and negative energy clash. Maybe because of the energy point where the town sits, maybe because of past deeds, but Selma has become the point where yin and yang clash to provide a spectacle for the rest of the planet to learn from what explodes in Selma. And if that's true, if that is a nexus point where energies clash, there could be the possibility that there's a crack being opened every time that energy is at its peak. Selma's had that for a long time. The Creek Native Americans lived on what is now Selma for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. When they arrived, it was founded by William Rufus King, and he named it Selma, which means high seat or throne. Now, William Rufus King, went on to be the United States' 13th vice president. 13. Significant number. Not necessarily a lucky number. And it wasn't lucky for King because he died in office. He died 45 days after he was inaugurated as Vice President of the United States. 45, not necessarily a great number. 4 plus 5 equals 9. 9 is the number for death. And he died 45 days into his administration. Now, of course, King represented the clash of energies that were responsible for the removal of the Creek Indians, who had sat on that throne for thousands of years before Europeans, hundreds if not thousands of years before the Europeans set foot on the continent. A disturbance in the energy. One king taken down, another put on the throne. King himself presided over another clash. He drafted or helped draft the Compromise of 1850, which sought to stave off the Civil War. So he was on the front end of what would become the Civil War, and he himself tried to avoid that war by negotiating the Compromise of 1850. Now, what do we know about King? Besides sharing the name of another man who would show up some 80 years later and clash again in Selma. What do we know about him? Well, he's the only U.S. executive to be inaugurated outside of the United States. He was inaugurated in Havana, Cuba, because he was so ill prior to his inauguration. They said he died of tuberculosis. He was a Freemason, and he was a Jacksonian Democrat. Jacksonian Democrats were responsible for the Trail of Tears, yet another energy point that may have manifested itself in Selma. Selma, during the Civil War, was considered the second most important source of weaponry for the South during the Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. A war that claimed the lives of more Americans than all of the wars combined. Which also featured the Battle of Selma because of its importance in producing weaponry for the South. Move forward to 1912. The energy of Selma seems to always attract positive and negative, yin and yang. 1912, Edgar Cayce pulls up roots out of Kentucky and moves to Selma. Who is Edgar Cayce? He's a psychic that was known as the sleeping prophet, a man who could, under self-hypnosis, predict the future, prescribe medical treatments not known to that time or generation prior to his description of them, including using pins to mend broken bones. Edgar Cayce shows up and sets up shop on Broad Street within a stone's throw of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Working by day as a photographer with a photography shop, and by evening and night as the sleeping prophet. What would bring a man of his stature, his ability, to Selma? He could have a shop anywhere because he traveled the globe providing these predictions. He spent many months outside of Selma visiting all the major cities because of his prominence and the accuracy of his predictions. He was the 1900s version of Nostradamus. Something called him to Selma. I don't have to tell you about the 1960s civil rights movement, which brought the second king to Selma, Martin Luther the King, as opposed to William Rufus the King, but this time to try to set the balance between blacks and whites at the voting booth. Now, King's movement came some 70 years after people like Hattie Hooker Wilkins pushed forward the women's suffrage movement in 1892. Some 30 years after the Civil War, attempting to get the vote for women. Another battle point featuring the sexes, men and women, with women seeking to balance the equation by getting the right to vote. Or so it was pitched. The footnotes of history will tell you that suffrage movement gained momentum because the women vote was viewed as a counterbalance to the black male vote. So you have a tripolarity in terms of the power struggle in that period that catapulted forward into the civil rights movement. You think Selma has enough energy floating around in that spiritual gumbo that would have been enough to break open a crack in the dimensional fields to our reality, to let strange things happen? Is there enough positive energy with the civil rights movement, the clash on that bridge that linked two pieces of land together, Selma and Selmont, black and white, enough to create a whole that would allow people like Williamson to disappear in thin air? Did that energy sink into the soil or open up a hole or a door wide enough for the living and dead to share the same space? I don't know. But I can tell you, in my time living in Selma, I've seen too many ghosts. When I was in preschool, I attended the Reformed Presbyterian Church preschool program for kindergartners. It's located on what is now J.L. Chestnut Avenue. And my parents worked as teachers, one in the city system, city public school system, and one in the county. And we lived 50 miles from Selma in a small community called Linden, Alabama. So we would have to get up really early in order to make it to school on time. And they would drop me off at Reformed Presbyterian Church really early, sometimes 30 to 45 minutes before classes would start, so that my mother could continue driving out into the county, which was another 45 minutes to an hour for her, in order for her to make it on time to work at 7:30. So being the first kid to school every morning and being a pretty young tyke, the director of the program made it his business to get there early too. And he put me to work. I would set up the chairs, clean the chalkboards, and he and I, over time, developed a great friendship. The harder I worked, the more snacks he gave me. So the more I worked. He was a great man. He looked like Thurgood Marshall and dressed twice as well. Nice suits, perfectly pressed white shirts, conservative ties. I can remember one Sunday evening as I completed my chores and dumped out the garbage and retired to sleep. I fell into what can best be described as a violent sleep. A hard, draining sleep. I awoke as if I was snatched out of my sleep and decided to walk down the hall to the bathroom, which was no more than 3 to 4 feet from my bedroom. The house was dark. My brothers were sleeping in their beds. I was on the top bunk of a bunk bed. So I slithered down the ladder and began walking towards the bathroom. As I turned the corner into the hallway, there he was, standing as if he were standing in the church school, smiling at me the way he did every morning I showed up early to help set up the chairs and clean the chalkboard. I could smell his cologne. I saw the shininess of his shoes because he was one of these gentlemen that every detail counted. And as quickly as I stumbled back from seeing him in our hallway at what had to be 2 or 3 in the morning, he was gone. But not just gone. I knew he was gone for good. Can't tell you why or how. I just knew he was gone for good. The drive to Selma for me was a long one. The anticipation of what that meant loomed heavy on my head. And when we arrived, we were told that he had passed late that night or early in the morning. But I knew. I felt as though he paid me a visit. Fast forward to the first grade, Edgewood Elementary School. At the time, Edgewood was predominantly a white school, though the school district was integrated. Myself and a young man named Kenty Lewis, we called him Ken, were among the first African Americans in my first grade class. And when he saw me, he came over and said, "Let's be friends." To which I greeted, "Great, more friends the better." But before I could say that, he followed that up with, "Because I have sickle cell anemia, I don't know how long I'm going to live." Very mature, very straightforward, and in my face. I may not live long. It's cool, man. Ken and I became fast friends. Ken made a lot of friends because he got the most out of every day, knowing that his days were limited. In the 7th grade, Ken caught a cold. He did not feel well in first period, and by lunch, he was being rushed to the hospital. By that evening, he is pronounced dead. I attended his funeral along with all the other Boy Scouts in our troop, Ken was a member. We all showed up in our Boy Scout uniforms and sat on the same pew behind the family. I fought as hard as I could not to cry. Even harder not to grab the hand of the Boy Scout sitting next to me. The emotional anguish was incredible. When the funeral was over, there was a procession to see and view the body. My legs would not move from the bench. I could not walk up to the casket. Moreover, I could not bring myself to go to the grave and watch them lower him into the ground. But it was not long after that when that same rush, that same violent sleep came over me again. And this time, for whatever reason, I was where he was. Where that was, I don't know. I had fallen through the door, and I was with Ken. He looked at me, I looked at him, and he said, "Hey, what's going on? I don't know what's going on." And that's all he kept saying. I had no answers. That went on for what seemed to be an eternity. And then I was snatched out of that reality and back into mine. In high school, another of those emotions or trances, whatever you want to call it, came as I fell into sleep. And there was Ken. He had grown up. His face had changed. He was older. He was bigger. And he was more comfortable in his skin. He had gotten his driver's license before me. And he wanted to drive across country and talk and tell me all about his life. We drove and drove. We talked. We stopped at some amusement park and rode the roller coaster. And he explained more to me about what he thought the future was going to be and what he was going to be. And though he still didn't have the answers, he was more comfortable. We made it to the West Coast. From what I can remember. And we stood and looked out over the ocean. And Ken just talked to me of his feelings and asked about people back on my side of the world. And in the blink of an eye, I was back. Ken and I had one more visit since that one, and it was in the Grand Canyon. and we were sitting atop some of the highest structures, rock formations in the canyon. And we moved from that in a mere blink to somewhere in the Arizona desert. And we just talked, and he said, "Mark, everything's cool. I get it. I understand what it's all about. You don't have to worry about me anymore. You can just let me go." We shook hands, and it is not like the touch you have in a dream. It was the touch of someone where I could feel the warmth in his hand. We embraced. I remember thinking, he's about 5'9". Wow, he shot up. We stood on top of a rock formation, and he reminded me of just how beautiful this planet was. And when I turned to answer, he was gone. This time I didn't just fall back through the door. I sat there, felt the breeze, and my soul slowly crept back in to this reality. My next encounter occurred my senior year in high school. The deacon at my church, Arthur Davis, was a math teacher and a wonderful human being. He was in the fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha, and a man who inspired me to pursue the same calling into that fraternity. When I struggled with calculus, my parents encouraged me to go get tutored by him. I went to him and he said, "Yes, just come over to the house and I'll tutor you in calculus." The session probably lasted 5 minutes. He said, "Son, you look smart enough to do it. Now just go do it." That was it. I think he realized all I needed to do it was just a little more confidence. It seemed to get easier to me after he said that. Not much long after our tutoring session, Mr. Davis went into the hospital for what seemed to be something routine, and he never came out. Miss Davis, his wife, at the time of his passing, was taking care of her grandkids. She knew my fondness for Mr. Davis and asked me if I would come and babysit the grandkids while she made funeral arrangements and while she also hosted the watch night service. So for a couple of nights, I would have to be there with the kids until she returned from making all the arrangements for the funeral, which will be late into the evenings, close to midnight. I show up right after school, walk over from Selma High to their house, which is just a mile or so away from the school, if that. And she just gives me the instructions on what to give them for dinner and everything, and then she proceeds out the door and leaves me with the kids. And there were 4, ranging in ages from about 3 or 4 years old up to 7 or 8 at the time. So I start setting the table and getting them their food so that the oldest sibling then would take them and give them their bath and start getting them ready for bed in a couple of hours after they finish their homework and watch a little TV. After I got the food on the table, I decided I would work on my homework, and I was going to sit at Mr. Davis's folding at his desk in his office, which was straight across from the dining room table, where I could sit at his desk, work, and then, occasionally turn around and make sure the kids were at the table doing what they needed to do. I'm sitting there working and reading, and then I hear all the kids clapping and like they were at a picnic. But what I heard didn't make sense. It's Grandpa. It's Grandpa. It didn't register as making sense at first. And then it clicked. They're talking about their grandfather who had just passed. So I swivel in his wooden chair to turn back to look into the dining room where the kids were seated. And as I turn to look, there's a glass filled with juice that I had poured for the youngest child moving across the table. The kids were clapping because Grandpa had come to have dinner with them, as he had done most nights when they were there. The glass stopped at the head of the table where he sat. My heart at that point was in my throat. I could not speak. I did not notice that I was trembling. The very opposite of the grandkids, who by this point felt like they were in the company of what they were missing, their grandfather. Staring in the direction of something I could not see, but what I had seen move the glass to its place at the table. After about a minute, but what seemed like an hour, I mustered up the courage to walk into the dining room with the kids. And I said, "What was that?" And to a person, they all repeated, "Grandpa. He's here. He's walking around the house now." And that's all I needed to hear. My head was swimming, dizzy, heart racing. Those kids were seeing something I could not see other than the physical expressions of what was causing them joy. Maybe it was their love. Maybe it was their age that allowed them to see him. Miss Davis came home that night, and I was waiting for her as she came up the drive and opened the door and said, "Miss Davis, I have something I need to let you know, because I don't know if there's something wrong with me." The kids were eating their dinner and they said Grandpa was here. I told her, and the scary thing was I saw a glass move across the table to his spot. She began to laugh and clap and said, yeah, Arthur's here. He's been doing stuff like that all week. Sitting in his chair, moving stuff around, just to let us know he's still watching us. I was supposed to spend the night with him that night so that she could go back to the watch night. I just pulled up a chair. I was not going to go to sleep. I knew Mr. Davis loved me, but I did not want to test that by falling into one of those violent dreams that I seem prone to always having. I want to conclude with one about my mother. When she passed, she gave instructions to leave her in her house for as long as she could before the coroner or the ambulance would come and pick her up. She loved her house. Spent a lot of time curating and putting things in that made her happy. So I guess much like the grandkids, about a year later, I'm in the house and I turn to walk into the living room, the one that she would never let us use because it was for company. You all know that if you're my age. Your parents have sofas that have plastic on them because that's for company. That's the company room. And as I turn the corner, there she is, sitting in her favorite chair. And in an instant, she was gone. Selma is the high seat, the throne. And maybe because of all of that energy, these things are being seen by more and more people. And maybe they will never stop being seen until the rightful king returns to that throne and seals the crack and lets those restless souls stop wondering. Or maybe I'm the only one that's seeing ghosts and seeing strange things in Selma. This has been Event Horizon, the show that takes you on a paranormal walk with a splash of the conspiracy.